With the launch of World of Warcraft Midnight, it is becoming increasingly clear that the overall feel of the game at the beginning of the first season will differ noticeably from what many players are used to from previous expansions. Normally, a new expansion or season begins with everything revolving around the new raid. Boss kills, the first set bonuses, and the classic PvE progression within fixed raid groups. In Midnight, however, this focus shifts significantly, at least during the first few weeks, toward Mythic Plus dungeons and PvP. The main reason for this is not a sudden design whim, but rather the timing of the season launch and the way players are able to obtain their first guaranteed tier set items. Season 1 of Midnight officially begins on March 18th, 2026, but the new raid, March on Quel'Danas, does not open until April 1st, nearly 2 weeks later. Mythic Plus, on the other hand, starts just 1 week after the season launch, on March 25th. This creates an unusual situation. Players who normally plan their set progression primarily through raiding simply have no way at the start to obtain their guaranteed tier set item from raid bosses, because the raid is not yet available. At the same time, there is a seasonal achievement that, just as in previous expansions, grants a charge for the set catalyst. This achievement can be completed via PvP raiding, Mythic Plus raiding, or alternatively by defeating a heroic raid boss. Since the raid option is unavailable at the beginning, PvP and Mythic Plus remain the only realistic paths to securing an early guaranteed set piece. In practice, this means that a large number of players, regardless of whether they primarily see themselves as raiders, dungeon players, or casual players, will deliberately focus on arenas, battlegrounds, or keystone dungeons during the first few weeks. An early set piece represents a massive power increase, especially at the start of a season, because set bonuses often enhance class mechanics or significantly improve rotations. Players who gain access to these bonuses earlier are not only stronger later in the raid, but also have clear advantages in further dungeon progression and in PvP. As a result, the start of Midnight will feel less like a traditional raid-focused launch for many players, and more like a phase in which Mythic Plus and PvP serve as the main stages for progression. Alongside this development, the Midnight Beta clearly shows that Blizzard is working intensively on the dungeons themselves, and doing one thing above all else: nerfing them. It is striking that there have been very few real buffs in the tests so far, but numerous nerfs, particularly to the damage of enemy abilities. The reasoning behind this appears to be a fundamental design goal. Blizzard wants to prevent dungeons, especially in randomly assembled groups, from collapsing into complete wipes due to single mistakes or poorly telegraphed mechanics. Caster enemies were particularly problematic in this regard, as their spells often dealt extreme, barely controllable damage. In response, damage values in several dungeons have been significantly reduced. A particularly clear example is the dungeon Windrunner Spire, where multiple abilities were heavily nerfed. The damage of Bolt Gale, for instance, was reduced by roughly 1/3, while the periodic damage of Turbulent Arrows was lowered by around 40%. Other enemy abilities, such as damage over time effects or persistent ground effects, were also noticeably toned down. In other dungeons, changes focused more on bug fixes and improved visual clarity of mechanics, allowing players to better understand what is happening and how they are expected to react. These adjustments are no coincidence, but instead align closely with the role Mythic Plus plays at the start of Midnight. If a large portion of the player base is spending significant time in dungeons early on, those dungeons must function not only for organized pre-made groups, but also for random groups that are not perfectly coordinated. Blizzard therefore appears to be deliberately choosing to reduce damage spikes and frustration first, rather than defining difficulty purely through punishing numerical values. Whether these dungeons will still feel challenging enough at very high keystone levels later on will only become clear once the expansion goes live, but the direction is obvious. The entry experience is meant to be fairer, clearer, and less chaotic. This is precisely where the third major discussion surrounding Midnight comes into play: boosting and the role of gold. A column on Buffed paints the picture that Midnight, particularly due to the new scaling of rewards in the Great Vault, could become an especially attractive environment for boosters. The core of this concern lies in how Mythic Plus loot is structured going forward. While completing a plus 10 key still grants a Myth track item from the Great Vault, the quality of rewards increases significantly at higher keystone levels. At plus 12, plus 15, and ultimately plus 18, players receive not only higher item levels, but also more advanced Myth track upgrade tiers. This means that ambitious players will not want to stop at plus 10 in the long run, but will instead aim for higher keystones to optimize their gear. At the same time, these levels will be difficult for many players to reach, whether due to time constraints, lack of consistent groups, or personal skill limitations. This is exactly where the boosting market emerges. Players with enough gold can pay highly skilled groups to carry them through these high keys and, in return, gain access to significantly better loot from the Great Vault. When all three topics are considered together, a fairly clear overall picture of Midnight Season 1 emerges. The launch will be strongly shaped by Mythic Plus and PvP, as these activities are available earlier and allow for guaranteed set progression while the raid initially takes a backseat. At the same time, Blizzard is actively adjusting dungeons to make them more accessible and less frustrating, an important step during a phase in which many players are effectively required to spend time there. Meanwhile, the new reward structures make high keystone levels more attractive than ever, potentially increasing demand for boosting. As a result, Midnight does not begin as a traditional raid-focused expansion, but rather as one in which system design, timing, and reward structures play a decisive role in determining where players invest their time. Whether this model will ultimately prove motivating or problematic will only become clear once the expansion is live. What is already evident, however, is that Midnight will be played very differently in its opening weeks than many expansions before it.